Wrapping up this third and last day of the Munich Security Conference 2026, I think a lot of people will go away from this conference thinking, well, that could have been worse. Of course, with something very fresh in their mind, last year's speech by the U.S. Representative Vice President JD Vance. This year, Secretary of State Marco Rubio did not have any of those sort of in-your-face insults to European Union countries, direct criticism of certain countries, and in some cases counterfactual criticisms. Marco Rubio's speech was more about how to improve transatlantic unity, how to restore the bonds. But upon further reflection, when you listen to the speech again or read the transcript, you see that this was very much portrayed in a way that if the European Union and European countries follow the way that the United States would like them to do, curb migration, stop so much spending on social programs and put it into defense, then there's more of a chance for improvement in these ties. At the same time, it very definitely was a conference where people were looking for ways to improve the relationship between the U.S. and Europe. This conference has always been a touchstone for that relationship where, there were large congressional delegations coming here and meeting with their European counterparts, and everybody was talking in very positive terms about what can be done together. There are a lot of world crises that need the U.S. and Europe to work together, and we are going to see tests of that relationship just in the nearest days. More talks between Ukraine and Russia brokered by the United States. Europe still very much feeling that there's too much pressure put on Ukraine and not enough on Moscow. So we will see peace talks coming up on that. Of course, people very much worried about what's going to happen in Iran and what the United States will do there. So there are going to be some testing times just in the nearest days and weeks, but I think we definitely wrap up this Munich Security Conference, which was under the theme Under Destruction, with a lot of hope that next year there can be a more positive theme for the conference and that there will be more ways to talk about reconstructing the traditional transatlantic ties that have defined the relationship for decades.
Let's bring in Domitilla Sagramoso. She is a security expert with a focus on Russian foreign policy at King's College London. Domitilla, welcome again to DW. The Munich Security Conference has concluded, and it was dominated by a reassessment of transatlantic ties. What does that mean for the war in Ukraine?
Yes, I think that, of course, the question of transatlantic relations is crucial for European countries. We've had this alliance for so many decades. It's been the cornerstone of European security. And, there is hope that the Americans are going to be supportive in all the efforts that Europeans are carrying out to end the war in Ukraine in a positive way, where peace is just and where there is, accountability. So I think that, yes, it's correct to argue that Marco Rubio hardly mentioned Ukraine in his talk. I think his focus was very much on sort of rebuilding a relationship, but very much along the lines of the sort of the MAGA creed. But, still, trying to highlight the points that we have in common with the United States and Europe. But I think that doesn't mean that Ukraine was not relevant. There were many panels that were discussing Ukraine and security guarantees, support for Ukraine. And if we look at the speeches by the key note speakers, from Chancellor Merz to President Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, the presidents and prime ministers of countries like Finland and also Denmark. There was a lot of support for engaging, and bringing in the Ukrainian question and trying to find a way out. And if I may add, what was interesting is that a lot of Democrats from the United States, they were also very clearly highlighted, the relevance of Ukraine.
We mentioned it earlier. You reiterated it. It bears a re-echoing. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio skipped Ukraine talks with European allies. In fact, barely mentioning Ukraine at all during his speech. Is Washington's interest in ending the war waning, you think?
I don't think so. I think that the Americans are very interested, but it's really not Marco Rubio's remit to a certain extent. I mean, the dossier is now in the hands of individuals like Witkoff and Jared Kushner, because the Americans, that what Trump is really interested in is also to develop this sort of financial and economic partnership with Russia. And that is an issue of concern to the Europeans. But when you listen to others, for example, Mark Rutte, he highlighted how the Americans, would be allegedly, that's what he said, providing a lot of the necessary sort of backup for the security guarantees that are being discussed at the moment. And if we look at the security guarantees, it involves not only sort of monitoring, helping with the monitoring and the assistance of the ceasefire, providing massive military support to Ukraine, but it also involves what we call this reassurance force, which would be led by the French and the Brits. And here is where the United States, it is hoped that it will play the role of sort of the backup. And it seems that, the Americans are still, supportive of this. I haven't seen an indication that they're pulling out in that sense. But what is really important now, if I may highlight, is that Europeans are really carrying the main burden in Ukraine, both financially, economically, and also militarily. And I think that we need to stay focused. We need to develop our own capabilities. We need to develop our own support for Ukraine and worry a bit less about the United States, because this is a variable that we might not control in the future. So what we really need to focus on, and I think that came very clearly across from the speech by, for example, Chancellor Merz and also President Macron, is let's focus on our European defense. Let's work with the Americans, but let's make sure that Europe develops the necessary military capabilities and introduces the necessary pressure on Russia with an additional package of sanctions, with challenging, the shadow fleet, so that we operate in a way that we can really be actors in these negotiations. I think that is also very important, that we are not marginalized as Europeans in these negotiations, because Europeans are really carrying the main burden, and we're talking about security of the European continent.
Understood.
So I think that. Yes, sorry.
As you know, the next round of negotiations are due to start on Tuesday. After little progress last time, is there a sense that this time could be different?
I think what is really interesting about these negotiations, which was highlighted to me, is the fact that we know very little of what is happening, in terms of the details of these negotiations. And I think that is something positive. It means that maybe they're discussing very concrete aspects of how to monitor and introduce an effective ceasefire line. And I think that could be a very positive development. I think, of course, the question around territorial, exchanges remains, very controversial. The Ukrainians are not going to hand in territory to Russia that the Russians do not control militarily. But there are elements where we may see some advancement. But I am of the view of, which was expressed very clearly by Chancellor Merz, that it seems to me that Russians are still not ready to make the necessary concessions, and additional pressure is necessary. Additional military and economic pressure, he said, is necessary to make sure that the Russians make the right concessions. And I think that he, in that respect, is right. So we need to follow this sort of double path. We talk, we try to reach an agreement, but at the same time, we support any kind of military, assistance that Ukraine needs. And this also may involve, purchasing American weaponry. I mean, I think we should not completely ignore that, there is this channel that is necessary, especially for air defense. So I think there are a lot of elements in the puzzle that are there, but additional pressure on Russia is still required.
That's a security expert, Domitilla Sagramoso from King's College London. Thank you.
Thank you.